Imagine waking up at 3 a.m., only to find a shadowy figure standing silently at the foot of your bed. The faint sound of breathing fills the room, but you know it's not your own. Heart racing, paralyzed by fear, you barely have time to react before the figure slips back into the shadows, vanishing just as quickly as it appeared. Tonight, we step into the darkness to uncover the chilling true story of a predator who terrorized an entire city under the cover of night. Over a span of 14 agonizing months, a series of brutal and unrelenting attacks shattered the peace and left thousands gripped with fear. This is the story of the Night Stalker, a name that would forever haunt the streets and hearts of Los Angeles. In the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was a city of stark contrasts. Neon lights and palm trees lined the boulevards, while Hollywood glamour masked the city's harsher edges. Beneath this glittering facade, however, a dark undercurrent flowed, a sinister presence that would soon turn the city of angels into a landscape of terror. It was during these years that a shadow began to loom over Los Angeles, one that crept silently through neighborhoods, leaving behind a trail of fear and violence. This shadow belonged to Richard Ramirez, a name that would become synonymous with nightmares. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, Ramirez's early life was marred by an upbringing filled with trauma, violence, and disturbing influences. As a young boy, he witnessed things that no child should ever see, and it would mark him for life. Friends and family would later describe him as a child who was both deeply troubled and drawn to darkness. Those early years would set the stage for a descent into depravity and horror that no one could have foreseen. And as he drifted west to California, that shadow would follow, lurking in the shadows, waiting for night to fall. It was a warm June evening in 1984, and Los Angeles had settled into the quiet of the early hours. But in a small apartment in the city, a horrifying scene was about to unfold, one that would signal the beginning of a wave of terror. Jennie Vincow was a 79-year-old woman living alone, a beloved grandmother with a peaceful life. On June 28th, she became the first known victim in what would come to be known as the Night Stalker murders. Her body was found brutally attacked and her apartment ransacked. The brutality of her murder was shocking, even to seasoned detectives. There were clear signs of forced entry, and it quickly became apparent that the killer had left no mercy in his path. To the people who knew Jennie, it was incomprehensible, and to the community, it was terrifying. Yet no one knew that this would only be the beginning. In the months that followed, Los Angeles would be rocked by an increasing number of attacks, each more violent, more unpredictable, and more twisted than the last. The killer seemed to strike at random, with no discernible pattern, no warning, and no regard for age, gender, or background. Homes that had once been sanctuaries became places of dread. Doors that had always been left unlocked now had bolts, chains, and alarms. Each new crime scene revealed a pattern of sadistic violence and a chilling disregard for life. Reports would describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Victims who had been attacked in the dead of night, their last moments steeped in terror. And the killer, leaving behind cryptic signs, would vanish back into the night without a trace, as if he were some kind of phantom, a shadow slipping between the cracks of the city. The escalation continued. A man was shot in his home. Another woman was found brutally assaulted, her home marked by symbols that hinted at the killer's fascination with dark, twisted themes. This was not simply a criminal. This was a predator who fed off the fear and suffering of his victims, a man whose taste for violence grew with each attack. The city was paralyzed. Over the span of a year, nearly every community in Los Angeles felt the impact of his violence. Some families were devastated beyond repair, forever scarred by a night that could never be forgotten. And the randomness of the killings meant no one felt safe. The killer's victims seemed to be chosen by fate itself. The fear spread like wildfire, reaching into every corner of the city. People felt watched, vulnerable, as though the killer were waiting just outside their doors in the darkness. As the body count grew, the LAPD's frustration grew with it. They struggled to find any substantial leads, any clue that would unmask this elusive figure. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo were at the forefront of the investigation, piecing together fragments of evidence from each gruesome scene. But the killer was always one step ahead. He left behind tantalizing signs, but no clear path. Each crime a twisted puzzle that hinted at the mind of someone both ruthless and cunning. Over the months, the press began to feed on the hysteria. Headlines warned of the Night Stalker, painting a picture of a monster that lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike when the world was asleep. Rumors spread, adding layers to the fear and uncertainty. People spoke of strange symbols found at the crime scenes, hints that the killer was no ordinary man, but someone who took pleasure in terror and in the suffering he left in his wake. Yet, for all the fear and pain he caused, the killer moved through the city with an eerie calm, as though he thrived on the panic he created. Families clung to each other, people avoided going out after dark, and neighbors watched each other's backs. And all the while, the Night Stalker continued his dark journey, a figure that seemed almost supernatural in his ability to evade capture. A nightmare that haunted the streets of Los Angeles. The Night Stalker had a modus operandi so chilling, so ruthless, that it remains ingrained in the collective memory of Los Angeles. Richard Ramirez was not a typical criminal. His methods were calculated, precise, and deeply unsettling. Ramirez's attacks were random and brutal, showing a terrifying disregard for his victim's age, race, or background. He struck wherever he pleased, often entering through unlocked windows or doors in the dead of night, slipping silently into homes where families should have been safe. For many, their first sign of the killer's presence was the moment they felt the cold blade of his knife, or the terrifying sight of a gun pointed at them in their own bedroom. Ramirez's violent spree didn't follow a conventional pattern. His crimes were chaotic, unpredictable. But there was one pattern that began to emerge: the dark marks he left behind. In many cases, Ramirez would scrawl satanic symbols on the walls of his victims' homes, leaving messages in blood or ink. A pentagram, a star within a circle, became his signature. Some reports say that he even left the symbols on the bodies of his victims. For the detectives and the people of Los Angeles, these symbols were a stark reminder that they were dealing with a man who saw himself as an instrument of something far darker than mere violence. As authorities pieced together his crimes, a psychological profile began to take shape, one that was as disturbing as it was incomprehensible. Ramirez had an open fascination with Satanism and the occult. His beliefs weren't simply for show, they were deeply rooted and intensely personal. He wore a pentagram drawn on his palm, which he'd display in court later with a chilling declaration: "Hail Satan." This obsession was not a passing curiosity. It was a consuming part of his identity, shaping not only his actions, but the way he wanted to be perceived. Psychologists would later explain that Ramirez's fascination with Satanism added an unrelenting layer of terror to his crimes. He seemed to derive power from the fear he instilled in others, as though his actions were part of a twisted ritual rather than random acts of violence. This belief system allowed him to view his crimes as something larger than himself, as though he were part of a cosmic battle between good and evil. In his mind, he was the embodiment of darkness, acting on behalf of forces beyond mortal understanding. This mindset made him particularly dangerous, as he saw no boundaries, no limitations, only the drive to instill terror and fulfill his twisted purpose. But perhaps most chilling was the cold detachment with which he carried out his crimes. To Ramirez, his victims were simply part of the ritual, mere symbols in his self-fashioned crusade. Each break-in, each attack, was like a piece in a carefully curated nightmare. He knew how to use silence, how to become part of the night, watching and waiting, unseen until it was too late. And as news spread of his gruesome signature and satanic beliefs, fear gripped the city even tighter. Parents locked every door and window, while communities came together in an attempt to guard against a terror they couldn't fully understand. Yet, the Night Stalker continued to strike, undeterred by the panic he'd created. His desire to spread fear became insatiable, as he stalked the streets with only one mission: to bring darkness to the lives of those who dared to feel safe. The question of why Ramirez committed these atrocities may never have a satisfying answer. But what became clear was that he was not merely a man committing crimes. He was a predator lurking in the shadows, driven by forces both psychological and deeply disturbed. He thrived in the fear he instilled, fed off the chaos he created, leaving a trail of trauma and pain that would never truly fade. As the chilling wave of violence spread across Los Angeles, it became clear to law enforcement that they weren't dealing with ordinary crimes. Each attack followed an eerie and brutal pattern: homes violated, lives stolen, and no one seemed safe. With every murder, the sense of dread deepened, as though an invisible predator was prowling the city, striking at random and vanishing without a trace. In response to this horrifying trend, the Los Angeles Police Department assembled a dedicated team of detectives to hunt down the elusive killer. Leading this charge were detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, both veterans in homicide investigation, yet neither had faced anything quite like this. For Carrillo, a young detective new to the department's elite homicide unit, this case would become his ultimate test. Salerno, meanwhile, was already a respected investigator, known for his work on another infamous string of murders by the Hillside Strangler. Together, they would need every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of resilience to track down the criminal the city now called the Night Stalker. As Salerno and Carrillo delved into the case, they found themselves piecing together what little evidence was left at each crime scene. There was no single pattern for how he entered a home, sometimes through an open window, other times a back door left unlocked. He didn't seem to care about his victim's age, race, or gender, adding to the randomness and terror of his attacks. Forensics teams worked tirelessly, sifting through fingerprints, footprints, and fragments of evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. Public fear escalated to an unimaginable degree. News of each attack spread like wildfire, and media coverage was relentless. It was the media who dubbed him the Night Stalker, a name that would haunt the city and amplify the terror in every household. People became prisoners in their own homes, checking locks, installing extra security, and some even slept with weapons within reach, just in case. Across Los Angeles, the usual sense of safety was shattered. No neighborhood, no home felt secure from the shadow that prowled the city. For Salerno and Carrillo, the pressure was constant. They worked around the clock, often facing dead ends and frustrations as the killer continued to strike, seemingly without pattern or purpose. Still, they pushed forward, hoping to catch a break, some shred of evidence that would lead them to the man responsible for this nightmare. Then, the investigators found their first solid clue. At one of the crime scenes, they uncovered a distinct footprint left in blood, a unique shoe print that became a vital piece of the puzzle. It was a rare shoe imported from Asia, with only a limited number sold in the United States. If they could link this print to a suspect, they would finally have the breakthrough they needed. As detectives combed through records, they learned more chilling details. This was a killer who seemed to take his time in each home, savoring the terror he inflicted. They heard accounts of whispered threats, satanic symbols scrawled across walls, and a level of violence that spoke to something dark and twisted inside him. This was no ordinary predator, and they knew he wouldn't stop unless they found a way to end his reign of terror. Meanwhile, the public grew more fearful, their sense of security replaced by an ever-growing sense of unease. Headlines blared with updates on the Night Stalker and his latest victims, and for many Angelinos, the city itself began to feel haunted. People avoided leaving their homes at night, neighborhoods felt empty after sunset, and the fear of being the next target loomed over every family. The sense of paranoia and helplessness became as pervasive as the smog over the city. Day after day, Salerno and Carrillo chased leads, each one pulling them deeper into the dark mind of a killer who seemed to relish the fear he left behind. As they delved into his movements and motives, they began to realize that this was a killer without remorse, a shadow that existed only to bring darkness to those in his path. But despite the relentless horror, Salerno and Carrillo refused to give up. The task force kept pushing forward, knowing that each day the killer remained free was another day he might strike again. With each lead, each painstaking search, and each sleepless night, they edged closer, driven by a singular purpose: to bring the Night Stalker out of the shadows and into the light of justice. For over a year, the people of Los Angeles lived in terror as the Night Stalker prowled their streets. His reign of violence seemed unstoppable, and the police struggled to catch him. But on August 31st, 1985, fate and a vigilant community would finally put an end to Richard Ramirez's deadly spree. In a twist of poetic justice, Ramirez's capture didn't come from a dramatic police raid or carefully planned stakeout. Instead, it happened in the light of day, under the intense heat of an East Los Angeles sun. That morning, Richard Ramirez, unaware that he had become one of the most hunted men in the country, walked into a convenience store. It was here that a woman recognized his face, his dark, intense eyes, and the now infamous hollow cheeks from police sketches circulating the city. She shouted for help, alerting others in the neighborhood. Ramirez, realizing he'd been recognized, bolted out of the store and ran down the street, hoping to escape. But the community had had enough of the terror he'd brought upon their city. As he sprinted through East Los Angeles, residents joined together, giving chase. Men, women, and even teenagers became part of a growing crowd determined to bring the killer to justice. Ramirez darted through streets and alleys, but there was nowhere left to hide. Eventually, he was cornered and subdued by the same people he had terrorized. An angry mob wrestled him to the ground, holding him there until the police arrived. In that moment, the terror that had gripped Los Angeles was finally over. Richard Ramirez was in custody. The journey to justice, however, was far from over. What followed was one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in California history. In the years between his capture and the start of the trial, the public's fascination with the Night Stalker grew. But nothing could prepare the jury, or the world, for what would be revealed inside the courtroom. The trial began in 1988, and Richard Ramirez showed no remorse for his actions. Dressed in black, often flashing an unsettling smile, he quickly became known for his chilling courtroom behavior. When asked to enter his plea, he held up his hand, revealing a pentagram drawn on his palm, and declared, "Hail Satan." His words echoed in the courtroom, leaving an eerie silence that underscored the depth of his descent into darkness. Over the next year, the prosecution meticulously presented evidence, detailing each horrifying crime. Witness after witness, victim after victim, their testimonies painted a picture of a man consumed by violence and devoid of empathy. Photographs of crime scenes, accounts of brutal attacks, and medical reports laid bare the gruesome details of his spree. The evidence was overwhelming, but Ramirez remained defiant, as though he took pride in the pain he'd inflicted. The defense attempted to argue that Ramirez was a product of his environment, a childhood filled with abuse, exposure to extreme violence, and traumatic experiences. They claimed he was influenced by a cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who boasted of horrific acts and introduced a young Ramirez to graphic violence. Yet, despite these arguments, the sheer brutality and calculated nature of his crimes left little room for sympathy. As the trial neared its conclusion in 1989, the jury deliberated, faced with the gravity of their decision. In the end, after weighing the evidence, they returned a verdict. Richard Ramirez was found guilty on 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The court sentenced him to death, declaring that his punishment would fit the unimaginable pain he had inflicted upon so many. But even in the face of his fate, Ramirez remained chillingly composed. As he was led out of the courtroom, he uttered one final, defiant statement: "Big deal." Death always went with the territory. "See you in Disneyland." His words were as unnerving as they were perplexing. A final reminder of the cold detachment that had driven him throughout his reign of terror. The capture and conviction of Richard Ramirez brought a sense of relief to the people of Los Angeles, but the scars he left behind would never fully heal. For over a year, residents had lived under a shadow of terror, afraid to go to bed at night, haunted by the knowledge that a predator could strike at any moment. When Ramirez was finally caught, a community could breathe again, yet the damage was done. In the aftermath, there was a heightened awareness of the need for security and vigilance. People installed new locks, invested in security systems, and paid closer attention to the safety of their homes and families. The case of the Night Stalker was a chilling reminder that the city's bright lights could mask dark, unseen dangers. After a long and high-profile trial, Ramirez was sentenced to death in 1989. Yet he would spend over 2 decades on death row, his chilling presence lingering in the minds of those who remembered his reign of terror. It wasn't until 2013 that his story came to an end when he died in prison from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. Though he is gone, the legacy of fear he created still echoes in the hearts of those who lived through it. His name remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the light, and the scars of his crimes are etched into the history of Los Angeles forever. The tale of the Night Stalker serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can exist beneath the surface of society. Behind the bright lights and busy streets, a predator moved unseen, feeding off fear and slipping through the shadows of the very city he terrorized. Richard Ramirez's story is not just one of violence, but of a life forged in abuse, trauma, and twisted influences. A background that would shape one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. His actions left scars, not only on his victims and their families, but also on a community forced to confront the terrifying reality of true evil lurking in plain sight. As we reflect on this chilling chapter, we're reminded of the thin line that separates the safe from the sinister, the ordinary from the unimaginable. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think drives someone to such darkness? Is it nature, nurture, or something else entirely? We'd love to hear your thoughts.